So when it comes to free speech, it's kind of a it's a hard conversation to have at times when things are spiraling wildly out of control. In the age of a pandemic, I tend to believe that free speech extremism has to soften a bit because we're talking about overwhelming amounts of potential death. And that's kind of like how I justify it. Then again, if you're trying to speak purely on the notion of philosophically, you'd have to answer the question, well, how much death is too much death? At what is a threshold and where you say, okay, maybe we have to figure out ways to stem the tide of fake news and science and health misinformation. Like what is that threshold? And I don't know what that is. I don't know what that is. All I know is I have seen time and time again the real cost in human life that comes from misinformation. And well before the whole COVID pandemic thing hit, I've got video after video after video on my main channel of this kind of thing happening. People using a fake cure and their kid dying. Or, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. goes over to the island of Samoa, and the next generation of kids that are born, they have this massive outbreak of measles because he convinced the moms that the measles vaccine was deadly and going to do all this horrible stuff to the kids, and over 80 children die. So trying to balance that out is very difficult. YouTube has a lot of problems, but they do make some efforts here and there. I've got my own problems with YouTube here and there, but I can't complain too much. It has provided for me and my family in the past. They have taken steps to try and address the overwhelming flood of COVID-19 misinformation, the anti-vax claims. They are now going a bit further, and YouTube is now blocking all anti-vaccine content. There's a couple of problems with this, but it also might be good. So it's a very short article, but we have a lot that we need to talk about in regards to it. September 29th, YouTube will block all anti-vaccine content, moving beyond its ban on false information about the COVID vaccines to include content that contains misinformation about other approved vaccines, it said in a blog post on Wednesday. Now, on one side, this is good because, as we have seen, when you drop in vaccination rates, that's when outbreaks start to happen. Measles is more dangerous. Let me say this very clearly. Measles is more dangerous than COVID-19. It is. I don't believe that there's a possibility that it could actually destroy more people's lives than COVID-19 because our vaccination rate will always be somewhat high-ish. But if it dropped enough, it's not just death. Measles can cause blindness. It can cause all sorts of health complications. It can ruin lives, destroy lives. And it's vastly, vastly more contagious than COVID. So is there a basis for this potentially being a good idea? Yes. Examples of content that won't be allowed on YouTube include claims that the flu vaccine causes infertility and that the MMR shot, which protects against measles, mumps, and rubella, can cause autism, according to YouTube's policies. There's a two-pronged reasoning why that might actually also be a good thing as well. It's not just that it's wrong, it's misinformation. It can cause people to drop their vaccination rates, putting their children unnecessarily at risk. Those kids don't get to make that decision for themselves. They rely on their parents, who might have gotten sold on some of this shit, which at times, sometimes you can't even blame a parent because they're flooded with this stuff. There's so much of it that if you are not discerning enough or know how to navigate the waters of science misinformation, you could very, very easily start to believe just because of how much there is out there. But also, it's incredibly fucked, the claim that MMR causes autism, because it does not. It cannot. It cannot. You will be autistic or not, even before you're born. It is predetermined. Okay, we know that it is not this fucking vaccine, and it is horrifically dehumanizing to misrepresent one of the most pivotal factors that might impact somebody's life by then trying to attribute it to something that has overwhelmingly saved millions and millions and millions of lives. So again, the online video company owned by Alphabet Incorporated is also banning channels associated with several prominent anti-vaccine activists, including Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Joseph Mercola, a YouTube spokesperson said. Again, good, because these people do incredible amounts of harm. But will that necessarily stop them? We'll get to that in a moment. A press email from Mercola's website said in a statement, "We are united across the world. We will not live in fear. We will stand together and restore our freedoms." Kennedy did not immediately respond to requests for comment. This move comes as YouTube and other tech giants like Facebook and Twitter have been criticized for not doing enough to stop the spread of false health information on their sites. But even as YouTube takes a tougher stance on misinformation, it faces backlash around the world. On Tuesday, Russian state-backed broadcasters RT's German-language channels were deleted from YouTube as the company said the channels had breached its COVID-19 misinformation policy. Russia on Wednesday called the move unprecedented information aggression and threatened to block YouTube. So, we have to kind of look at this from a perspective. We have to analyze it from a perspective of whether or not this is damaging to free speech. Yes, it does. It does. And no, it doesn't. The reason being is that, yes, if we want to be able to make all opinions and all viewpoints freely expressed, okay? We really do. And that is in the spirit of free speech, because we have to make the distinction. First Amendment, free speech, not really the same fucking thing. Not really. First Amendment is only to protect you and companies from the government telling what you can and can't say. That's what the First Amendment is. That is not necessarily the spirit of free speech. So along those lines, a company can still remove your ability to post on their platform because that's their property. You're only utilizing it. They can prevent you from that. That is not a breach of the First Amendment. Is that a breach of the spirit of free speech? Yes. But if what you're posting is misinformation, you are willfully, or kind of sometimes unknowingly, if you're just dumb, posting something that leads people towards a drastically different conclusion or understanding than what is objective reality, what we can actually prove, what we have evidence for, etc., etc., etc. In that regard, freedom of speech does not necessarily mean that all speech or all information is true. However, we collectively lose the more we believe falsehoods. We collectively, as a species, lose. We are stunted, we are stalled by continuing to fall for things that aren't real. In that way, the spirit of free speech might be harmed to a certain extent, but you have to consider that if we overwhelmingly buy into and believe lies, misinformation, propaganda, pseudoscience, quackery, then what value of that free speech? Like, where then can we measure the free speech that we have? If it's full of so much dog shit, then what value does it have? Now, what is the answer to balance these things out? I don't know. I really, legitimately do not know. I reject the notion that maybe we need some sort of like Ministry of Truth or the Department of Facts, you know, like the potential for abuse in that is immense and overwhelming. Huge. I don't really have an answer, but one thing that I do think is important to point out, and this is one thing that I really want people, especially people on the right who are economically on the right, free market capitalism. Since we understand that this is not a First Amendment issue, it's just a matter of the spirit of freedom of speech, then is your conviction in a free market capitalist society stronger than your desire to be able to say things that aren't true? Which is more important to you? Because these companies are allowed to operate in the same way that any other company can as well. These companies are doing what they want to do to make sure that their content fits into the parameters that they have determined. They are utilizing their free speech, their platforms, to do what they want. Now, in a free market capitalist society, the way that you change against this is you build something better, or you compete against them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Which is more important to you? Your ability to lie or your belief in free market capitalism? That's the question that people have to think about, that they have to ask themselves. I have to ask myself on a constant basis of whether or not I think that the censorship of harmful and dangerous pseudoscience is, if it's worth saving human life. I tend to lean that way. But I fully accept, and I do this every single time I talk about this, I freely accept that there is a cost and that it can go too far. And that is basically it's trying to look at something from a principled stance without having to necessarily dig your feet in and say this or that. You can have a spectrum of opinion between two things. And I think it's interesting, and I would really like to hear what you guys have to say in the comments down below. Thanks.